Boyhood's End is the culmination of William and Linda's 40-year-long personal and professional partnership. Over the years, they have collaborated on more than 30 theater productions, dozens of scholarly articles, books, plays, and music. Their advocacy and contributions to nonprofit arts organizations and individual artists have been celebrated here and abroad. Their Voices of Wounded Knee was the first book to give equal weight to the testimony of Native Americans and is considered the definitive book on this topic. We got a good team, don't we? William S.E.Coleman dropped out of high school and enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1944 at the age of 17. One of the last age groups to see frontline combat in World War II, he was awarded the Combat Infantryman Badge and 2 Bronze Stars for his service. After the war, he attended college through the GI Bill of Rights and enjoyed an illustrious career as an award-winning playwright, screenwriter, historian, author, director, and professor of theater arts. Linda Robbins Coleman is an award-winning composer, pianist, writer, research associate, and arts ambassador, whose music is regularly performed and broadcast throughout North America and Europe. She was the first Iowa woman to have music performed by a major symphony orchestra and to serve as composer in residence with any orchestra. We are thrilled to have her here tonight, so please join me in a very warm Beaverdale Books welcome.
Not half as thrilled as I am to be here. Believe me, it's been quite a journey. Thank you so much, Jan, and everybody at Beaverdale Books. I want to take this moment to give a plug to independent local bookstores like Beaverdale Books. They are really at the heart of our community. Those big box bookstores, you know, they got all sorts of books and such, but you know, they don't have a section devoted to local authors. I didn't know that till I went in and asked them and such. No, but Beaverdale Books does. And do you know that not the big stores, they don't do author signings, they don't promote cultural, they don't do Beaverdale trick-or-treating like Beaverdale Books did. So it is vitally important that we support our local bookstores because they are part of what keeps the heart in our culture and keeps local authors like me going. So thank you so very much. And I'd like to thank all of you. Oh my golly gee, I cannot believe the turnout tonight. I'm thrilled beyond words. And I'm also thanks to the people who are watching online. I know that there are some people who couldn't be here either because other commitments or because they live out of state. So I'm totally grateful for everybody that's attending here, either in person or on the live stream. So, and thank you for live streaming it. It's wonderful, even if they do have to look at my ugly mug. But anyway, I also want to take this moment as we start to acknowledge some special people here tonight. First of all, I would like to acknowledge my dear friends and kind of adoptive family, Eileen and Ron Bowerman. I've known Eileen since I was 14, and Ron was Bill's baseball buddy, and Bill considered him his best friend, like a brother. So they have been just such supporters to me throughout my life, and they kind of keep gluing me back together when I kind of fall apart. And so I'm very, very grateful to them. And then also to Rosalie Schultz, her beloved late husband, Robert Schultz. I affectionately called him Bob Dad because he was my adoptive father. Rosalie was my first piano teacher, and Bob was my last piano teacher. And when they eventually got married in 2003, it was just a perfect situation. And Bob was a World War II vet. And they were early readers of the book, and Rosalie was my grammar queen and my comma queen, and so I'm very, very grateful to Rosalie and such. So those two especially. And then Deanna Lale, who her husband Alan came to Drake the same year that Bill came to Drake. Alan was the choir director and taught voice at Drake, and Bill, of course, came as a theater professor. And so Deanna and I go way back and such. And again, she's one, we're opera buddies, and we get together, and she helps put me back together when I decide to fly off in a million pieces and such. And then I want to thank my fortnightly musical club friends, the Drake Theater alumni who are here tonight. The Iowa Clinic is well represented here. And so if I have a heart attack, my doctor can revive me and such. The Hoover High School class of 1972 is well represented here. The Section 10, Row 1 of the Iowa Cub Stadium is represented here with beloved Paul Yeager and such, and Kitty in the back, and just everybody. I'm just so very, very great. And neighbors and friends, Vicki and Lisa, everyone. Just thank you so much for being here. And sorry if and current neighbors, past neighbors, and Doug at Drake Development. So it is just it is like an old home week at the farm, and I'm so very, very grateful. So thank you. I just wish that Bill could be here with us tonight. As most of you know, he died in July 2015 after a long battle with cancer. If he were here, we'd be having a dialogue, and we would share reading excerpts from the book. Sadly, you're going to have to settle for just little old me. I hope I do it justice, and I hope I do him proud. But in one way, Bill is here. It's his words, his thoughts, and his essence that is on every page of Boyhood's End. Even though I've gone through the book many times over the last 10 years, every time I read it, I learn something new about him. It's like spending time and being with him again. And there's some chairs up here if you want to sit down. This is kind of informal, so don't feel you have to stand and such. So when I thought about this book signing, and as I look out over all of you who have shown your support of Bill and the book and me, I'm reminded of a couple of quotes from the movie It's a Wonderful Life. I think that the two quotes in particular pertain to this evening in a big way. Clarence, the angel in training who's trying to get his wings, says, "Strange, isn't it? Each man's life touches so many other lives, and when he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole, doesn't he?" Well, when Bill died, he left a huge hole in my heart and in the hearts of a lot of people. But again, I think he's still here with us in many ways. There have been times I've felt him. And believe me, he's still here in my house because I have all of his stuff. And he was a pack rat. Clarence the angel also said, "Remember, no man is a failure who has friends." And I'd like to thank you, my friends, for supporting me, for supporting Bill, for coming this evening. It absolutely means the world to me, and I am not going to cry. So, maybe. Anyway, so the plan for this evening is that I will discuss Bill and the making of the book for a while, and then I'll read some excerpts from it, and then we'll open it up for questions and or discussion. And after that, if you haven't already, you can buy a copy of the book and have some treats. You can also have treats now if you want. They're in the back. But I'll be most happy to sign the books for those who want that. And, I could still forge Bill's name, but, and I'm going to keep this under an hour, hopefully, since Beaverdale Books closes at 8 o'clock, so, we'll need to be out of here by then. So, and by the way, Boyhood's End is available in both hardcover and paperback. It's in hardcover for $29.95 and paperback for $21.95. And if you like the book, please leave a review at the online booksellers so that, we can get a little more traffic on it and such like that. Although I would prefer you buy your book from Beaverdale Books. It wouldn't hurt for you to put the reviews up there, since that's where it's also available. Now, please forgive the fact that I'm referring to an outline during this signing. I'm afraid I'm a bit rusty at these things, and keeping to my written thoughts that will help keep me from rambling or going off the rails or getting off the subject. So I want to make the best use of our time together. So these are all my words, but at least the ones that I wrote for me, and not Bill's words. But I just wanted to keep organized, and that's how I do it. So first of all, the introduction. William S.E.Coleman loved telling stories. It would be no surprise to anyone who knew Bill that he came from a family of storytellers, talkers, and teachers. As a young bride new to the family, I was amazed at the amount of reminiscing at his family gatherings. Although members of my own family were also talkers and teachers, events from our past were rarely shared with others. Over the years, I came to know Bill's family stories better than my own. I loved listening to his mother talk about Bill's youth and how, being an only child, he always had his nose in a book, or he was listening to music, and he seemed to be much older than his years. From our beginning, I knew that my husband lived during a unique and powerful time in world history. Early on, he told me that he was a combat infantryman in World War II. Since he had dropped out of high school and enlisted in 1944 at the age of 17, he was one of the last age groups to see frontline combat in the war. And he said he couldn't lie about his age to make himself appear younger, because then he'd have to forget about that, and it was such a part of his life. Well, while I've heard about many World War II veterans who never discussed the war or their combat experiences, my husband spoke and wrote about it throughout his life. He wrote a couple of plays, he wrote a screenplay, he wrote articles, he wrote a lot of things about it. And, of course, Boyhood's End. I, however, was a post-war baby. There was quite an age difference in our lives. I was a post-war baby, so I had no memory of the Great Depression, the attack on Pearl Harbor, or World War II. But my parents did, and those events defined and shaped their lives and attitudes, and they, in turn, passed those on to me. That was one of the reasons Bill and I could find a lot in common. My father and his mother were born in the same year, so a lot of the cultural references were the same. Well, most of you here tonight, well, actually all of you here tonight, already know me, and you most likely knew my beloved Bill. If you didn't know him personally, you probably at least knew about him. You might have attended one of his productions, seen one of his original plays, read some of his articles, or purchased our book, Voices of Wounded Knee, about the massacre in 1890, so published by University of Nebraska Press. Bill was certainly quite a character, and I see heads nodding at that. And his talents and intellect were unique. Originally, I was going to use this segment to chronicle many of Bill's amazing accomplishments as a professor, director, actor, playwright, screenwriter, author, and Renaissance man. But since our time is limited, I have instead decided to just tell you that if you want to know more about the remarkable life and career of William S.E.Coleman, Bill, Doc, my sweet buckaroo Billseye, and my cutie pooch, you can read more about him in the back of Boyhood's End, or on his website, WilliamS.E.Coleman.com, or on my website, LindaRobbinsColeman.com, or just various other sources. Bill was one of a kind, and his life was truly remarkable. I miss him every day. It was my great honor and privilege, bless you, to spend 40 years with this incredible man, and I am so grateful that I've been able to finish this book in honor of his life. So, why Boyhood's End was written? Well, in 2002, after a long and illustrious career as professor of theater arts at Drake University, Bill retired to focus his creative talents and energies on writing and going to baseball games. Section 10, at the I-Cubs. So during those wonderful years of amazing creativity, I encouraged him to set aside some time to write down his family stories and history so that future generations could enjoy them long after we were dead and gone. I know that legacy was important to Bill. Much to my delight, he heeded my request. Bill's memoir was not an organized effort, nor was it a concentrated one. When he had a few minutes between projects, he'd write down some thoughts. Over the next few years, the file on his computer grew until it was about 900 pages long, and he hadn't even progressed to the point of his first marriage. I was wife number 3. When I expressed surprise at the length, it was long even for him, he told me that he was writing more than just events. He was also writing about the times he lived in, the culture that he grew up in, and what it was like to be a young man at that point in history. I found that intriguing. He wanted his grandchildren to get a sense of the era and to learn more about their own family and how it was affected by the culture, events, and societal views. I asked Bill if I could read some of his memoir. He was pleased at my request and printed out the first half. As I browsed through the pages, I arrived at his memories of the attack on Pearl Harbor and his experiences in the Army. Given that this was about the time of renewed interest in World War II and members of the Greatest Generation, I told him that this section might make a good standalone book and one that would be of interest to more people than just his immediate family. Now it was his turn to be intrigued. I volunteered to help organize and edit it for him, knowing that this was one of his least favorite writing tasks. Well, as I worked on the manuscript, I quickly discovered that my biggest challenges would include organization, repetitions, and fact-checking. I also knew that a majority of people alive today don't have a personal recollection of the World War II era, so I had to be attentive to the history and culture of that time. If Bill glossed over something that might confuse young readers, I would need to define and clarify that, as well as introduce or describe many of the important figures who shaped those times. And that's how Boyhood's End began. Well, what is Boyhood's End about? Well, where were you when President Kennedy was shot? Where were you at 9/11? Most of us can vividly remember when these historic and life-changing events happened. Few here, however, are old enough to remember arguably the most critical date of the 20th century, Sunday, December 7th, 1941, the day when the United States was attacked by Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by Japanese forces. Boyhood's End is the remarkable true story of a young man finding his way through a changing culture and a world at war. From high school through his enlistment in the Army, from his experiences as frontline combat infantryman in Patton's Third Army during the Rhineland Campaign, to his discharge from the Army on July 1st, 1946, this Memories and a Memoir is an intimate portrait of a personal journey through an epic time. One thing that makes Boyhood's End even more special is the inclusion of lengthy excerpts from Always First, the 417th Infantry Regiment history that Bill co-wrote and co-illustrated at the end of the war during occupation duty in Germany. Not only that, peppered throughout the book are more than 100 illustrations and cartoons that Bill drew during that time. Many of these illustrations were used in Always First. While, sadly, most of the letters he sent home to his family or received during those years were lost somehow, I was able to find some letters and V-mails to include, along with numerous photographs. That's one of the miracles of today's publishing world and digital publishing, is in the past you couldn't have included so many photographs or illustrations, and now you can. It's just, it doesn't cost anymore except for how many pages the book is. Now I'd like to say a side note about our World War II veterans. When Pearl Harbor was attacked and war was declared on December 7, 1941, the population of the United States of America was about 133 million people. In contrast to that, our current population is about 350 million people. During the next 4 years, more than 16 million Americans served in World War II. That was more than 12% of the total population. Of that 16 million, approximately 800,000 of all U.S. military personnel experienced serious combat in World War II. That is less than 5%, and it includes both the European and Pacific theaters of war. The infantry represented only 14% of troops overseas. And I read somewhere that the ratio of support personnel to combat personnel was more than 12-1. Wow. While there has been a resurgence of interest in the Greatest Generation in recent years, the number of actual combat veterans who shared their stories of this remarkable time is relatively small. Even fewer are those combat veterans who are professional writers like Bill. According to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, less than 150,000 of those 16 million people are still alive today. These men and women, all in their mid-90s or older, are dying at the rate of 180 per day. Only a handful will be alive in 10 years. What's remarkable about Boyhood's End is that it introduces a new voice into the canon of World War II accounts. This Memories and a Memoir provides readers with a fresh perspective on an era that is quickly disappearing from our view. So, there are many sections in Boyhood's End. It's divided up into 8 sections. The first quarter of the book begins with Pearl Harbor Day, takes a brief look back at the Great Depression years, and describes what life in New Kensington, a small town near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was like during those years. The second quarter of the book goes from when Bill drops out of high school to enlist in the Army and then is assigned to Virginia Military Institute, where he will begin training to be an engineer. Everything changes when D-Day invasion happens on June 6, 1944, and he is transferred to the real Army to begin his training for the infantry at Camp Wheeler in Georgia, a camp that no longer exists. The second half of the book begins with Bill's voyage across the Atlantic to join the 417th Infantry Regiment of the 76th Division of General George S. Patton's Third Army in the European Theater of Operations in the Rhineland Campaign. Readers will get a vivid description of what it was like to cross the Atlantic and also cross the Rhine as they begin the big push towards Berlin, and the challenges he and his company faced as riflemen on the front lines during the last 2 months of the war in Europe. I'm going to take just a couple of seconds, and I'm going to pass the chair back for a late arrival.
Oh, we've got more chairs.
There are more chairs?
Yeah, there's more chairs.
Okay, so I want people to be able to sit as I yammer on. And so, anyway, so the challenges he and his company faced as riflemen on the front lines during the last 2 months of the war in Europe, from March through May. Challenges Bill faced included participating in the longest infantry march in American military history, trench foot, March fracture, dealing with dysentery from the voyage over there through his combat months, going into battle with a rifle that jammed, digging foxholes and being shelled, going on patrol, and advancing and taking towns under fire. There are humorous moments, too, along with acts of brotherhood and bravery. Bill's honesty and openness in describing the fears and terrors, the challenges and triumphs, and all that he witnessed while participating in one of the world's most decisive events is compelling. After Germany surrenders, occupation duty begins. Bill describes guarding a slave labor camp. That was pretty grim. Capturing a circus, facing the threat of the werewolf terrorists who garroted people with wires. Working on the division history, trips to Paris that included a visit to the Folies Bergère nightclub, and going to the Louvre Museum on the first day it opened following the war. He also describes his voyage back to the States. Then, after a brief leave to visit his folks, he completed his service as an occupational counselor in Kentucky until his discharge from the Army on July 1st, 1946. The story ends as he leaves the Army base and heads to the train station. And the reason he wasn't discharged until 1946 was because if you brought 16 million people back to the States and after the war, which ended in 1945, and put them into the workforce, the economy couldn't handle that. So they timed out when people were discharged. And it was like how many points you got and when your number was up. So Bill's number didn't come up until July 1st, 1946. The war in Europe ended in August of 45. Well, for his service, Bill was awarded the Combat Infantryman Badge and 2 Bronze Stars. He was really proud of the Combat Infantryman Badge because that you had to have served in combat to have received it, and you couldn't have been higher than a colonel to get it. Well, the last part of Boyhood's End is titled Reflections. It contains his thoughts on those years, the influences his experiences had on the rest of his life, and his general thoughts on war and life. The 8 sections are: Part 1, A Date Which Will Live in Infamy; Part 2, A Young Man Goes to War; Part 3, The Real Army; Part 4, Into a Theater of War; Part 5, Into the Heart of Germany; Part 6, Occupation Duty Begins; Part 7, Odyssey's End; and Part 8, Reflections. And of course, since he loved Greek theater, he had to have Odyssey in one of the sections. So, Now, as far as completing the project, I'm not going to go into all the bloody details, but I go into much greater detail in the book. So if you want to learn more about how the book was actually put together and ended up published, read the book. But for these purposes, I will say that by June of 2015, after Bill had received his terminal diagnosis and it was obvious that his days were numbered, we had managed to get through the rough draft of the book. In fact, the last week of his life, I was frantically reading to the end. He said, though, that when we'd worked on it, he said that I had caught his voice and that he gave me the blessing to complete the project. He did, however, make me promise that I would take care of myself and work on my music and not throw away my talent, and I have tried to keep that promise. But the death of my husband was so devastating that I couldn't even look at the manuscript for a couple of years after his death. But slowly I was able to resume working on it, and then my music business took off and the pandemic happened and it began to look like the book would never get published. But here we are. But the beauty of it is, once the initial grief wore off, it was like spending time with him. So it ended up being great. Now, choosing excerpts to read was really difficult. The book is, after all, 534 pages. So part of the reason for that number was because I tried to make the type bigger and give enough space so that it was easier to read. But some of the excerpts that I will read now have been edited down, just condensed a bit, Cliff Notes version, for space. And so if you arrive at them in the book, read through them, because there's a lot of worthy paragraphs that I'm not going to read out loud. So anyway, so now on. So that's my yammering about the book for now. So now we'll go on to actually reading some of the excerpts. And I tried to choose some excerpts from different parts of the book to give you a little bit of the flavor. And it was hard, though, because some of it, if he were here, we could have done some dialogue. I mean, included in the book is like sections from a play or articles and things like that. So what I tried to choose was more just a tone and just more of getting a sense of his voice in the book and his thoughts about it, because that's one of the things that makes this really remarkable, is his eloquence and ability to express what he was observing and what he was living and what he thought about it. So the first excerpt I'll read is from part 1, A Date Which Will Live in Infamy, and it comes about page 92, and it's from An Interrupted Senior Year. So this talks about during the time that he dropped out of high school to enlist in the Army. While the shadow of a raging war that was going much too slowly hovered over us, we concentrated, perhaps too much, on being teenagers. My friends and I traveled together as a pack until we broke off into dating. We went to movies together. The main movie theater confined teenagers to the balcony. There was a good reason. Boys can be rowdy. Too often there was a running commentary on the movie. I remember one Pennsylvania Dutch boy who went with us, chiming in with his guttural voice and quaint accent at moments on the screen. His comments often sent the balcony into gales of laughter. The movie was I Wanted Wings. It was a wartime tribute to the Air Corps that was also an action movie. It was Veronica Lake's first starring role. In one scene, she wore a dress that was deeply cut, almost to the navel. When she moved, we got tantalizing but brief glimpses of the swell of her breasts. Her exposure was a little more than the Hayes office usually allowed, but some production standards were lowered after the war began. Amidst hooting and whistles, our friend shouted, "Did you know she has TB?" Silence. Then he added, 2 buttes. The theater exploded in laughter. That included the downstairs adults, too. Our ribald friend turned 18 just as he was about to begin his senior year. He died in combat on a little-known Pacific island less than half a year later. I will always remember that odd voice. I will always remember his wide smile. I will always remember his quaint Pennsylvania Dutch accent. I just wish I could remember his name. The next excerpt is from the end of part 1, An Age of Innocent Ends. The first, like I said, the first half of the book talks mostly about what it was like growing up and what it was like living in the community, and talks about school and the classes. It's fascinating talking about what education was like in those times and what classrooms were like and the studies and the classes they took. So it's fascinating, a slice of life. Anyway, end of part one. This is really one of his most philosophical, and it just touches me every time I read it. It's called An Age of Innocence Ends, and it's about page 110. A time of innocence, of adolescent pain and joy, and a great deal of wonder came to an end as I prepared to leave home for the first time. One word best describes my memory of my boyhood: wonder. I remember the lingering and lonely whistle of the midnight train floating across the great Allegheny River. I remember that river's deep green beauty, its steady power as we paddled our canoe, and the mysteries of its depths. I remember the Baroque paddle wheel steamboats pulling barge after barge of coal, moving down that river from upstream mines, pausing to go through a lock, then sailing on. They are certainly one of the most beautiful objects created by our country. I remember the immense train engines drawing more than 100 cars past our house in Parnassus. I remember taking a passenger train with my friends for outings at the Kennywood Amusement Park. Once there, I remember persuading a girl to ride in the flat-bottomed boats that passed through the Tunnel of Love, or to ride with me on the roller coasters. I remember going to the Allegheny County Airport to see the old Ford Trimotors take off and land. I remember biplanes and monoplanes. I remember going to air shows, and I especially remember going up on the heights above New Kensington to watch the mail planes sweep in, hook a bag of mail, and soar on to their next pickup. I remember carnivals and circuses, and especially the wonder of watching a circus come into town at dawn and the setting up of its main tent. I remember going to Pirates baseball games at Old Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. There I saw great players now in the Hall of Fame. I might add, he also got to meet Honus Wagner, who was one of the greatest baseball players who ever lived, whose baseball card is worth millions. Anyway, he didn't get one. Closer, he regretted that later. Closer to home, I remember watching legendary players in the Negro Leagues playing our Corbins. I remember sneaking in to play on their field. I remember playing at sports with my friends. I love the feel and the sound of my bat hitting a ball solidly. That is the true harbinger of spring. We played then for the joy of playing. Yes, we wanted to win, but the game was what it was all about. And we did it far away from the eyes of cheering and jeering adults. For a while, at least, we were in an exclusive boys' club. Some of my memories are fragmentary. I remember the excitement of discovering a book that would sweep me away from the world I lived in, the joy and sadness of jazz and pop songs, the power and complexity of classical music, the mystery and beauty of great paintings, the thrill of theatrical performances at Carnegie Tech, marveling at the enormity of dinosaur bones at the Natural History Museum, inventing with my erector and chemistry sets, drawing cartoons and writing poetry. I didn't know it then, but I was filling my mind for the years ahead. And I still have the erector set. Most of all, I remember the girls I danced with and dated. I remember the time I first put an arm around a girl's waist, of dancing close, our bodies moving together to the music we loved. I remember the mystery and beauty of those young, evolving bodies. I remember playing jukeboxes as I savored a hot fudge sundae, walking and shooting the shit with friends, delivering newspapers, working at a grocery store, glitter balls piercing a dark dance floor, asking girls to dance and hoping they would. I remember shedding my adolescence as I moved towards manhood. Looking back, I remember that in spite of it happening during the Great Depression and then while our nation was at war, my boyhood was a wondrous time. As I filled my suitcase, I packed away 17 years of my life. My emotions were mixed, and I was excited that I would be far away from parental supervision, but I did not realize that I would be facing something even much more severe, the rigors of being a soldier. There was sadness, too. A phase of my life was over. I was leaving my blue-remembered hills. As I closed my suitcase, my boyhood ended. The next section is from A Young Man Goes to War. And this begins on the D-Day, page 151. Following D-Day, there was little need for engineers of any sort, and the Army no longer was interested in training them. Our first semester at Virginia Military Institute was to be our last. We were done playing soldier. Now what the Army required was young bodies to feed the maw of an intensifying war. As soldiers fell, replacements were needed. We all knew we would be among those replacements. After we completed our 12-week term, we became cannon fodder. The god of war needed new flesh for his feast upon the young. On June 7th, the day after D-Day, I turned 18. 18. In the Army's eyes, I was now a man. Shortly after that, the term ended. Before I was assigned to active duty, I was given a short leave. This is 18-year-old Bill. As Virginia Military Institute faded into my past, my mind was racing ahead. I thought about the bigger journey looming in my future. Would I even have a future? Where would I be sent? I wondered if I would live long enough to find myself. Too many young men were dying. Too many never got to realize their lives. Their hopes, their dreams, and their potential to make a positive impact on the world were lost before they ever had a chance to try. Casualties had mounted since D-Day. I was swept with melancholy and a sense of loneliness. I felt terribly alone. Even though the fellow passengers on the train surrounded me, I couldn't speak to any of them. They were strangers. Some, I am sure, feared for a loved one themselves. Others might be grieving their own casualty of war. I had to keep my thoughts to myself. My apprehension was personal, something I had to deal with myself. A shudder passed through my body as a sense of fear swept through me. I couldn't concentrate enough to read. As I watched the scenery sweep by, a myriad of questions flooded through my mind. I looked at my hands. No, I stared at them. I stared at their reality. It was as though I'd never seen them before. I looked at my newly trimmed, carefully kept fingernails, at the bones and the veins beneath my skin. I looked at the reality of my hands and I said, what if they were blown away? What if I couldn't play the violin or the piano? What if I couldn't hold a knife or a fork or feed myself? Thoughts bombarded me. Questions overwhelmed me. My body shook in a massive shudder. What if I was blinded by the shrapnel? Would my wounds allow me to write, to draw cartoons, to read books? What if I had to spend the rest of my life in darkness? Then came the darkest thought of all. Was a partial life worth living? The answers to those questions came quickly. A sudden death was preferable. Then I pondered death itself. I wondered if there was a heaven and a hell. Now I had my doubts, but the concept of oblivion eluded me. Then the shudder passed. It was replaced by a numbness, an acceptance of what was to come. That numbness gave me a sense of calm. I didn't know then that my mind, my imagination, and my emotions had begun to shut down. I was too young to ask others if they shared these thoughts. Men didn't do that then. We were alone with our emotions. Showing them was a sign of weakness. I didn't know then that this shutting down would be my savior during what was to come. And what was come was into the heart of Germany. Crossing the Rhine, page 301. On the 27th of March, we entrucked and left Weibelsheim by motor convoy to cross the Rhine River on a pontoon bridge. We crossed the river at 0200, 28th of March, traveled south on the east bank of the river to the St. Gorishausen, where the convoy left the river, and traveled east to Nastatten when we detrucked. From here we traveled on foot, using an approach marching through Eggenroth, Hubert, and closing in on Hohenstein, where we were going to spend the night. That is from Always First, the regimental history that Bill co-wrote after the war. Well, by this time, the bridge at Remagen had been crossed. We were not the first to cross the Rhine, nor would we be the last. Within a few days, most of the soldiers in the European Theater of Operation, ETO, had crossed the Rhine and were racing into the heart of Germany. That night, when we crossed that broad river, we began the last battle for the conquest of the Third Reich. What was to come was an epic that exceeded even the most sweeping visions of Homer. We crossed on a bright, moonlit night. As we were some distance away from the river, we were loaded on trucks and rode to the river. Ahead of us was a pontoon bridge. It can be seen in the remarkable color documentaries taken by Hollywood film director George Stevens during the last weeks of the war. My memories of this time are largely in black and white. I remember a few colors, such as the blue-green of the surging seas during our Atlantic crossing and the eerie green-blue in the thick forests as we trudged through the Rhineland. The daylight filtering through the forest was a sinister but beautiful sight. One never knew what was out in front or what was behind the trees ahead of us. That added to the mystery of these woods that were lovely, dark and deep, and oh, so dangerous. There's a dash of brown and khaki in the images that fleet across my consciousness, and that odd, dusty green of German uniforms. Lastly, there are flashes of the brilliant red of open wounds and recently shed blood. That quickly turned to black. Over the years, I learned that many other veterans share a similar color memory of the war. It's like I lived in an old movie. As we crossed that swaying, surging pontoon bridge, a shell was lobbed into the river upstream. There was that familiar whistling sound, an explosion and a geyser of water 100 or so yards to our right as our trucks slowly made their way across that uneasy bridge. There was no stopping, no turning back. No one took cover. It was as though it never happened. That one shell burst was the only sign of resistance during our brief night crossing. Why only one? That remains a mystery to me to this day. A full barrage would have destroyed that bridge and sent us plunging into the swift Rhine rivers. On the other side, we dismounted, formed two columns, and one on each side of a paved road, and began what was the longest infantry march in any American war. None of us imagined the physical ordeal ahead of us. My bad ankle worried me even more. I was terrified because I knew those grinding ankle bones could give away with the next step. All fear of the enemy disappeared as I concentrated on taking the next step, then the next, and then all those that followed. Battle seemed simple besides the pain and exhaustion. I felt as we moved deeper into Germany, I had every right to drop out, but I refused to do that. The need to put my head down and survive without complaining made many of my combat experiences a blur of impressions. Some things stand out with great clarity, some appear in my memory as an impressionistic haze, and some do not exist anymore. Now the American army entered the center of Germany in force. At this time, neither tanks nor tank destroyers accompanied us. We had jeeps in our column, most carrying 150 caliber machine gun. Those were effective against aircraft and troops. They were completely ineffectual against German tanks. Only our bazookas were of use during panzer attacks. As we marched ahead in two columns, we kept about 10 feet between us. This meant that one shell would only get 2 or 3 of us. In many war movies, men are shown advancing in tight clusters. That was counter to all rifle squad strategy. For the moment, the weather was warm, and there was a mist of rain that I found refreshing. We had a 5-minute break every hour. I quickly learned to sleep most of those 5 minutes. One of our first breaks, I remember that I laid down on the pavement in a small village, resting my helmeted head on the curb. I managed a full 5-minute snooze before we were ordered back on our feet. Even now I can drop off in a few seconds if I feel the need of a nap. I must admit that my naps last a little longer than 5 minutes. I cannot remember whether we started the march at dawn or in the night. That first day of marching is just a blur in my memory bank. And there were 2 more days after that. And now I'll go to our final section, Reflections, page 483. Like I said, I didn't include any of the actual battles and stuff like that because I think his writing is such music and it speaks so well for itself. I'd rather you get it off the page. Reflections. A great many men functioned well and bravely in World War II. Some went far beyond any reasonable expectation in impossible situations. When things get rough and the situation is hopeless, the best of the best become existentialists. It is better to act than do nothing. Throughout my life, I have thought a lot about what courage is. I am glad that I was never pushed to the extremities of my own courage. And what is bravery? Bravery against great odds moves me to tears when I have seen it in life and on film. I have never thought of myself as a particularly brave person. I'm not sure about how courageous I have been during my life's crises. In combat, an act of courage often arises from an inescapable situation, a situation where one must act. Most men endured and fought just as men had stood against other men from the dawn of civilization, or what we call civilization. When you are in a group of men who have become your friends, you stick with them. You cannot give up even when you want to. We were not heroes. We did not fight for our country. We fought for our friends. We were a group of ordinary men who did what we had to do. We became a band of brothers. The men in the frontline infantry were remarkable human beings. They paid a great price. Not the least was the horrible memory of killing another human being. What that soldier brings home is not so much honor and glory, but a haunting guilt of the things he had to do in order to stay alive and come home. I feel that sense of guilt. Once I flippantly said that war was open season on humanity, but the reality was that there are men who lost the privilege of coming home to their loved ones, and I am the reason that they did not. I had killed other human beings. I have spent my life dealing with that. That memory goes with one to the grave and perhaps far beyond. I pass it off lightly when I talk about it. I have to. That way madness lies. There's a great line in the 1992 Clint Eastwood film titled Unforgiven. It's a hell of a thing killing a man. You take away all he's got and all he's ever going to have. When I heard that line a few years ago, I again had that sense of mourning those who died in my war and the wars that came after and before that. I am sometimes filled with sadness, but I do know that at the moment of killing, I had no other choice. I was an 18-year-old boy caught in the midst of events I never fully understood. I was not about to give up my own life so that an enemy soldier could live. How did I assuage that guilt? I do know that my choice to be a teacher is part of my penance. Giving something to the sum of things seemed important to me then. It still does now. I spent my working life trying to make a positive contribution to the world, to add to the sum of good things as a teacher and an artist. I have tried to live the lives of men I killed as well as my own. I hope that I have done well for them. I mourn them as well as my own fallen comrades. That to me is the tragedy of being in a world filled with wars and violence. Has there ever been even one moment of peace in this world during my long life? I don't think so. Will we ever find peace? In the last line of Boyhood's End, Bill says, "The best soldiers were men who didn't want to be there." Thank you. Before I open it up to any questions or whatever, I want to do a little bit of show and tell. This was Bill's uniform and such. So it's gotten a little moth-eaten over the years, but this was his combat infantryman badge and rifleman badge and good conduct and battle stars and things like that. And it fits me, but I just couldn't bear to put it on. This is a shirt from that time. So I still have his full uniform and a lot of things. There's a lot of stuff that I could have brought, but since it's 80 years old, it's very fragile. And I just didn't want to risk it. This Always First there was only a few hundred of them made, and I have a copy of this in regimental history and such. So the illustrations, I still have all these sketchbooks and all these things. But the beauty of it is you can see the illustrations and the stuff in the book, peppered throughout the book. And the illustration on the front cover is actually one. It was a sketch, and I cleaned it up digitally and such so that it would be appropriate for the cover of the book. And it was titled Fallen Comrade. And then this was Bill as he graduated from high school, his senior picture. He didn't graduate, but they handed out the photo. That was Bill in 1938. So this was, when you consider, that was only 3 years before Pearl Harbor. I mean, he's a baby. He's just a baby. And then this was him in the uniform. as he exited the army and the war, and so it's got all of his medals and such there. And then this one was him at Virginia Military Institute. Again, he just looks like he's a child. He is just a baby. Why do we kill our babies in wars and such? And so I look at those and I think, oh my God. And of course I had to include our wedding picture. But anyway, it just, but I just thought I would bring at least a few tokens and such. So I have all sorts of things. So anyway, and one other thing I want to say before I ask about questions is that, even though he talked about it and wrote about it and all that stuff, I know that there's no way I could ever really begin to understand what it was like for him and such. But a few years after he died, just a couple years ago, there was a movie that came out. Peter Jackson, the guy that did Moulin Rouge and did he do the Ring Cycle or something? Yeah. Anyway, he got World War I tapes from audio about what it was like to fight in World War I. And during those times, they also made silent movies during the war, in the trenches and all that stuff. Well, Peter Jackson colorized all this, and what he did over these silent movies was he used the narrations of these actual World War I veterans talking about what it was like. And so it just became so vivid. And I saw it out at the one out at Jordan Creek, that big theater with the big screen and such. And it was the hardest. It was hard to watch. But I thought, this is as close as I can get to understanding, because you actually saw pictures of the trench foot. You saw how they had to go to the bathroom, in a combat situation. You could actually almost feel the dirt and the grime and the terror and such, and just what war is. Movies can't begin to do it justice, but these were real films. So I think it's available on Prime or Netflix or whatever. But if you ever have a chance to see it, the name of the movie is "And They Shall Not Grow Old." They shall not grow old. It's a line from a poem and such. So I highly recommend it. It was hard to watch, but it gave me as close of a sense to what he actually went through as anything possible. So I thank you for coming. Is there any questions or thoughts or whatever? Shelley?
You said that he wrote about the war throughout his life, but on a day-to-day basis, did he keep a diary? Because his memories are so vivid.
Yes, they are. And
did he keep a diary?
No, he was not one to journal. He wrote plays. He wrote tons of plays and such. But there's a lot of him in various things and such. But no, he used to say, "Oh, our life is just too boring." And such. But he says, "Yes, no, we really are boring," and such. Which he always wondered why people laughed when he would say things like that. But when he did write about something, as you can see, he wrote about it pretty eloquently. And so, anyone else have a question about anything, whatever? Of course, you've listened to me yammer so much, you're probably... But, yes, Paul?
Did he ever pick up a gun after the war? I didn't think so.
No, he wouldn't want one in the house.
He wouldn't want it in the house, and he was death on violence.
He was a total pacifist. During the Vietnam War, he marched, and he grew his hair long and mustache and everything like that. He also hated the color khaki. And so he refused, after he was out of the army, he refused to wear khaki. He wrote a wonderful play called, its original title was A Stranger to the Past, and it was about coming home. And it was, the character wasn't entirely him, but it was about coming home after having fought, and the protagonist had been injured in the war and such, and then coming home to find the same bigotry and hatred in his own community that he'd fought against, and then confronting his own, and so stuff like that. He put those things into his plays and such, and but it's now called Odyssey's End, and Deanna's son, Philip Lale, did a staged reading of it at his theater in Houston shortly before Bill died. But Deanna?
I wondered did he object to standing in line? My husband wouldn't stand in a line after he got out of the army.
I don't remember
that.
No,
My dad did.
He avoided it, but if he had to, if it was something he really wanted to,
he didn't voice an objection.
Yeah, no, it was kind of weird how his reactions to having lived through this and dealt with this. Of course, they didn't talk about PTSD in those days. George S. Patton he was kind of demoted for a while for slapping a soldier, and which was, they called it shell shock and things. And I talk about that in the book, about what the difference in attitudes and such about PTSD and such. And Bill, but most of them, I think part of it was there were so many people involved, so just everybody kind of shared, what they went through during World War II, and so. It didn't stand out. I mean, when you consider the percentage of the population that were involved in the military or that participated in the war, that is, 12% of the overall population. When you think we don't even hear about our armies or what our troops are doing, we haven't since Vietnam. I mean, we want that to be a war that somebody else's children fights and such. So, but yeah, there was things about Bill that I knew over the years, and there was the occasional nightmares, and there was, I knew it affected him, but he was worth it. So anyway, yes, Barb.
Did he ever go back to Germany?
Yes, it was incredible. He went back, and I describe a couple of them in the book and such. Of course, he had an attitude about Germany for quite some time, but actually he liked it, and we gave lectures. We gave lectures in Heidelberg a couple of times and such, and he tried to retrace his steps actually a few times. Before we met, it was the first time he tried to do it, but the roads had changed so much, and just after post-war and such. And so he was able to kind of look at the new Germany and such, with although there was still, but the one thing he said at the end of the war was that he kind of looked around and he thought, who are the real winners here? And then he looked and he saw there's DuPont, there's Ford, there's Coca-Cola. They'll win regardless of who won the war, And so it did kind of make him a bit of a lefty tree hugger, liberal, too, and of course a big pacifist. So anyway, but Dave.
Did he have the opportunity to stay in touch with his band of brothers once he was?
There was just a couple and such. So there was one that he actually wasn't in combat with, but that he after the war in occupation duty, and I actually got to talk to him on the phone once. So it was shortly after we got together, but he's been long dead. And what was really cool was that because of his website, the granddaughter of one of his company got in touch with us. Mike Lepesky's granddaughter got in touch with us. And so he was able to share with her the sections of Boyhood. This was while he was still just beginning to write it. But he was able to, we had email conversations with her and share with her about what her grandpa had done in the war. And so that was really cool. But by the time the war was ended, they just scattered, and then just trying to find people. I've been able to find about what a lot of the people whose names I have, what happened to them, and when I did have that, I included it in the book. And so it was just I even found out that the guy that he roomed with at Virginia Military Institute was still alive like a year ago and such, and living in California. Amazing. So the internet has been a wondrous thing. Such, but no, it has shaped and affected him so much, and he talked about it. He loved telling the funny stories, and a lot of them are included in the book. So there's a lot of hijinks and funny stories, but you can read the book and read those, but then I also heard about the gruesome things that he really didn't talk about with others and such. So, anything else? I'm just so tickled, thrilled, and amazed that you all showed up. I mean, I feel unworthy, but I know Bill was worth it, and I'm just so glad and grateful that I could be the vehicle that got this to the finish line. Part of me was sorry it took so long, but part of me is that actually it kind of makes it more special now, because it is more of a rare gem to have this account, since we have lost so many of our World War II veterans. It's hard to believe that Bill would be 97 if he was alive. He died at 89 and such, so he was youthful until the very end. And so I was just very privileged and blessed and fortunate to have had something that clicked between us, and to have 40 years living with him, and of course 8 years of living with his ghost. And such things. Anyway, oh heavens. Well, thank you again for coming. I'm very, very grateful.